Kapital en driver av grønn vekst. Hvordan kan grønn finans fungere som en hurtigfil mot en renere fremtid? For å diskutere dette nærmere, ønsk velkommen tilbake på scenen Michael Sheren og Mugo Kibati. Samtalen skal ledes av Sony Kapoor.
Can I take the corner?
Yep.
Take the corner. So, well, we only have 12 minutes, so that's going to be slightly challenging. But let me start with you. We spoke about the financing challenge. What is your cost of capital for the wind power project and for the solar power? How much are you paying? And where does that capital come from in 1 minute?
Wow. 625 million euro. About 30% of it is equity from the various shareholders, and 70% of it is debt. And that was very difficult to get, even the equity, because, as I said, a very remote project in a country that is already not expected to be able to pull through a project of that nature. And we had to put up a lot of infrastructure around it, roads that, Norway would not need to do that. And so development finance was very, very useful because it was much cheaper, concessional financing, than we have no commercial banks, except for partial guarantees for the transmission line. So, but I do believe that this project should demonstrate to other financials, including commercial banks, that this type of project is viable and has a reasonable return on investment.
Understood. So what I heard you say was that without foreign long-term capital, partly because the quality and quantity of domestic savings in Kenya and much of Africa is so low, without long-term equity risk capital from foreign investors, you will never, ever be able to fulfill the energy demands and hence the development needs of most of Africa's population.
Yes, of course, I never say never, ever. But let's put it this way. We will really, really delay the much needed energy infrastructure development, especially in remote areas. I think that the foreign concessional financing from development partners, such as Norfund, was absolutely vital and crucial to the realization of this. Without it, we would not have a Turkana power project. And indeed, the rest of the infrastructure, the transmission lines that are being built also require that kind of financing.
What returns are we looking at, roughly?
Well, let me just say somewhere between 10 and 20%.
As a matter of contrast, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund presently has $100 billion invested in negative yielding government bonds, including German bonds, etc. And yet there are investment opportunities that have huge development impact that diversify the present portfolio of the fund, which essentially remain inaccessible to the fund because it is not allowed to invest on that. So Michael, you and I were having dinner and we worked together before on the UNEP inquiry. And one of the things that often came up was the frustration that on the one hand, you have $80 trillion of long-term capital that is presently earning very poor returns. And on the other hand, you have huge development potential, so-called structural factors. You have increasing demographics in much of Africa and South Asia. You have technological catch-up. You have great productive capacity potential. You have faster projected growth rates. And yet, the money doesn't turn up. Instead, the money stays stuck in the OECD. The money is given to the German government, and you pay the German government for the privilege of borrowing money from you. So what are the biggest impediments?
Well, I can take all 87 trillion. I think the new climate economy projected we need 90 trillion between now and 2030. So for a 15-year period for sustainable infrastructure globally. And roughly 2/3 of that needs to go in emerging markets. So how do you get the cost of a euro, a kroner, a dollar from where they sit to Kenya, to Cambodia, without being inflated and making it impossible for them to borrow? And that's a great question. So there's some things, if you take a look at the World Bank, the IFC, they make loans, and they might provide a loan for a particular project, let's say $1 billion project. But instead of doing the entire loan, what they could do is a 1/3 first loss position. That means you have the equity, then maybe a first loss debt position, and then a senior secured. And what you do is, you can, first of all, by taking 1/3 of the debt in a first loss position by the World Bank, you could take that billion they would have normally lent and put it over 3 different loans. So you would have crowded in 2.1 billion of hopefully money from these 87 trillion of pension funds, insurance companies that are getting sub or negative yields, and they can go to Africa, they can go to Asia, and they can be part of the solution of solving the sustainable development goals of the world.
And am I correct in thinking that in addition to having that huge, significant positive impact on the world, this will also help diversify their present portfolios?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the keys is we've got a variety of things that institutions can invest in, both equities and debt, and being able to have exposure to the growth areas of the world. Africa is going to be the growth, Asia is the growth. So to have all of our investments, and there's nothing wrong with holding German bonds, but you also want to hold part of the growth story of the world. And that's what Asia and Africa are about.
Understood. So the last I looked, 80% of the investments of these long-term investors, including the oil fund, where it's 88%, were in rich economies. And one thing that has happened is that the 2 biggest factors of growth in the rich world have essentially been turned on their heads. So half of growth in the rich world, including Norway, came from an actual increase in the number of workers. That has reversed and has actually started shrinking. And the second half came from productivity increases. Productivity increase in the rich world today is roughly half of what it was in the decades following World War II. And this means that the expected growth rates in the rich world, no matter who you look at, including the Norwegian government's own projections, are between 1/3 and half of what it expected in the emerging markets in the developing world. And the one thing you can do if you're a tiny hedge fund is you can generate returns of 20% year after year in an economy growing at 2%. But if you're the whole financial system, if you're a $1 trillion Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, you cannot, over the long term, generate returns higher than growth rates. So if you are going to finance your pensions, if the Norwegian fund is going to finance part of the welfare state, it funded 15% of government expenditure last year in Norway from the returns on markets. It has to go where growth is. And the other way of thinking about it is, again, why would you expose 88% of your assets to economies which are expecting poor growth, which are seeing rising political risk? Think Trump, think Brexit, think Catalonia, which are facing huge productivity challenges because they're much closer to technological potential, right? I mean, it's much easier to introduce new technology. I mean, Kenya has the perfect example of M-Pesa. A lot of Norwegian banks, including Nordea and others, are learning lessons from what Kenya did 10 years back. In India, we went from 2 landlines per 1,000 people to everybody having a mobile phone without having to construct wasteful infrastructure of putting in, and the same is happening with off-grid, on-grid power, for example. So this is what the big problem is. So how have you approached institutional investors, and how have they responded?
Well, as I indicated, I mean, to get to financial close in December 2014 took 9 years, and very difficult conversations. Getting, as you very correctly said, a project of this magnitude, 600 million euro plus, getting equity, local equity investment is almost impossible. Yeah. There are other much more attractive funding projects for local investors, for small local investors, but for international investors, this kind of a project you'll see more and more of, not just in Kenya, but across the continent and Asia. Because, and I think it's important to look at it this way. I think I gave the example of 45 million people on 2 gigawatts. This is a population that in my own lifetime has grown better educated, better economically empowered, more democratic, as the case in point right now where we have an election which is disputed, and we're going on about business. We're still discussing the transmission line, even as the election dispute is going on. This is different from 15 years ago. And I think it's important that Western countries recalibrate the risk profiling that they do. Because I tend to get to feel that you're still looking at the Africa and the Asia of the 1970s and 1980s with the same risk profiling. Today, if I dare say this, our project, which was complete 2 months ago, and as you asked me a question about rate of a specific return, that return was guaranteed. Well, the return wasn't guaranteed, but there are certain provisos, certain government imperatives that were guaranteed by the Kenya government. And while we were annulling our presidential election, the government was paying us 46 million euros for obligations not fulfilled because they care about investors being able to get their return.
So
the risk profile has changed.
Whereas the Norwegian government has been sued by Canadian investors for changing retrospectively the change of gas investment.
There you have it.
So, what was up is now down, and what was down is up. So in my mind, innovation, which is a very fashionable term at the Zero conference and in Norway, comes from three main sources. There's desperation, there's perspiration, and there's inspiration. And I think on all of those fronts, I mean, the desperation is definitely much higher in Kenya and in India, and you've heard of frugal innovation, etc. The perspiration, I mean, you would acknowledge Norway has become a complacent economy with, and the degree of desperation and hard work and hunger is much higher in emerging economies. As to inspiration, that's what the Zero conference is for. So, Michael, ending with you. Okay. The work that you're doing with the G20 and the task force, how is that going to help address this intermediation problem? Get the money to where it is actually productively contributing and generating sustainable returns? Well,
first thing is good news. A lot of the institutional investors are getting it. They're figuring this out. I had one of them approach me who has $2 trillion under management and said, look, I so badly want to get into Asia, I'm willing to do a structure that for every 2 euros I put into Chinese sustainable infrastructure, I'll put €1 into sustainable infrastructure in the Belt and Road, which is 65 countries, variety of different types of risk around it, but where there's going to be huge amounts of growth. And again, it's things around the first loss. It's about learning capacity around how do you take local banks and have them take their role? How do you get the international investors in? And again, getting good first risk in there. Use the multilateral banks for where they need to be, combating that first risk, crowding in institutional investors on the international level, good structures, transparency, disclosure, and the path of travel is that way. So I think ultimately, the good news is 5 years ago, we didn't have major institutional investors wanting to be in these countries. Now we've got them, and they're calling in. And I think the more they start doing it, the other ones who aren't playing, that aren't active, are going to see that the growth is coming there, and they're missing out on something. So that's the good news I'm going to leave you with.
Wonderful. We have 3 seconds left. So thank you so much for your patience. And hopefully we haven't been too much of harbingers of bad news. But we have ended on an optimistic note, showing part of the way out. And that may be lessons from Kenya. Thank you.
Mine damer og herrer, nå er det tid for et kort avbrekk. Velkommen tilbake etter pausen.